When a loved one dies, the first thing you have to do is plan the funeral. You have to pick the flowers, decide what coffin they'll be buried in, what they'll be wearing, who's coming, where's it at, what's in their will. It's not fun, and it's not anything anyone looks forward to. But today, I'm going to take you on a journey through ancient Egypt, where they not only welcomed death, but looked forward to it. They spent their whole life preparing for death. I've gathered a lot of research through books about ancient mummification, one of them being an interview with Egyptologist Salim Ikram, who is currently studying at the American University in Cairo. Today we're going to talk about the mummification process, the sarcophagus and the stela, as well as the afterlife itself. Please join me. The first thing we're going to talk about is mummification. Today, there are two main ways to go out. You can either be cremated or buried, unless you're Walt Disney and your head is frozen somewhere waiting for our technology to advance. But for the Egyptians, they only had one option, and that was mummification. According to Nova 2006, everyone got mummified, whether you were a pharaoh or a peasant. It just depended on how elaborately you were mummified, as it was kind of a pricey process. So the first thing that was done, according to the Eyewitness Book on Ancient Egypt, 1990, a large incision was made on their left side so that their organs could be removed from their chest cavity, except for the heart. The organs were then placed in what's called canopic jars. These jars were sacred, as they had spells written on them in hieroglyphics to ward off evil spirits. Next, the body was stuffed with linens and salt so that it could be preserved. The next step was the famous step that we all know when we think of a mummy, which is the wrapped linens, as you can see in this picture over here. Sometimes we see pictures of mummies with squished noses or sideways faces, and that's because of how quickly or how tightly the linen had been wrapped around the mummy. Something the Egyptians feared was dying outside of the country. If they died outside of Egypt, the mummification process couldn't be started right away, and it could inhibit their travel to the afterlife. Next, we're going to talk about the sarcophagus and the stela. The sarcophagus is our version of a coffin. As you can see on this picture, there's a face painted on it. According to Eyewitness Ancient Egypt, each face was the idealized version of the person. So to us as outsiders, they all look the same, but it was actually what they believed that person looked like. There were also other identifying markings, such as a red ribbon painted on around the neck if they were a priest, or their arms would be crossed if they were a pharaoh. Next, we're going to talk about the stela. The stela is like our version of a gravestone. On this stela, there's hieroglyphics that made a spell. According to Atlas of Ancient Egypt, 1994, as loved ones and family members passed by, they would read this spell or prayer, and it would help the spirit move through the afterlife. Next, we're going to talk about the crypt layout. This one is specifically for King Tut, but all of the pharaoh's layouts were pretty similar. You came in through the stairways, and there was two main rooms, the treasury and the burial chamber. In the treasury, that's where we find most of our artifacts, because according to PBS.org, the ancient Egyptians believed that your worldly belongings could come with you into the afterlife. So we may find their favorite clothes, makeup, because kohl-lined eyes was a very big thing back then, as well as gold and their prized possessions. Next, we have the burial chamber. The pharaoh would be buried in the middle with their sarcophagus and stela, as I talked about earlier. But according to PBS.org, in the first dynasty of ancient Egypt, servants were sacrificed and buried around the pharaoh. After the first dynasty, they saw this as a little too vulgar, so they no longer did that. So instead, they painted pictures of servants on the walls, and they thought that they then became alive in the afterlife. Finally, we're going to talk about the afterlife itself. So according to an article called Egyptian Afterlife, this is Anubis, the god of the afterlife. So as you can see, he has the head of a dog and the body of a human. This was a big trend in the Egyptian gods as they were human-animal hybrids. There is a specific reason that his head is black. It's because, like us and many modern cultures, they perceive black as the color of death, only they saw it as a happy color instead of a mourning one. Once you got to the afterlife, you had to go through the underworld. We have a negative connotation with the underworld because of Greek and Roman mythology, but it was just sets of trials and tribulations to be able to make it to Anubis. So once you get to Anubis, your heart is weighed against the feather of truth. That's why the heart was left in the body. If your heart was lighter than the feather, then you got to stay with Anubis. But if your heart was heavier than the feather, then you had to go back to the underworld. So you may be asking, how do you make your heart lighter than the feather? Well, as I said, they spent their whole life preparing for death. Their good works in their living life help them make it to the afterlife and have a light heart. So I want to thank you guys today for listening. I hope that I have opened up your eyes to the Egyptian culture, as it's not something that's talked about a lot in history classes, as much as Greeks or Romans, but it's just as instrumental to our world history. I hope you saw that all three parts, the mummification, the burial, and the afterlife, all work as one. You can't have one without the other. If you don't have the heart, it can't be weighed against the feather of truth, and if you don't say the prayers, then they can't be moved through the afterlife. Thank you.